Okay, we're talking to Ted Anderson today about the story of an electronic engineer and the CIA, his book, which is named The TopCat. How are you doing today, Dan?
Well, doing fine.
That's good. Just wanted to kind of dive in on the book and find out a little bit more. Number one, what is the book about? And kind of maybe, tell us why you wrote it.
Okay, well, as you know, I wrote my first book, which is called North and South, which is the stories and genealogy of my and my wife's ancestors. So I went back and dug up as much information as I could on everything that happened up to the beginning of my lifetime. And it took a long time. 7 years I worked on that to get all that information into one place. And I published it as a book. I really didn't intend it to be sold to the general public. It was more just to get the information down for my children and my grandchildren to give them something to start with when they began to ask the questions, well, where did all these Andersons come from? So that was the intent of North and South. The title came from the fact that my wife Sarah's ancestors tended to all be Northerners, and my ancestors tended to all be Southerners. And her people, if I can call them that, all fought for the Union, and my people all fought for the Confederacy, and so on. So we really had a divide between the two sides, the matriarchal and the patriarchal side of the family. But we all came together, and we had 4 great boys, and now we've got almost 12 grandchildren, and so we've got it written down as to how the North and South can actually come together. And after completing that, my son Drew said, Dad, that was really great, but you didn't say anything about you. What did you do? And he of course, had heard some of the stories that I had told, because I did travel around a lot. And he said, Dad, you got to write them down, because people don't know these things, and they need to know them too. So just about that time, one of my granddaughters, actually Amanda, was going to the University of Santa Barbara, and she was taking a class, I guess you could call it social studies, but whatever it was, they wound up studying the Israeli Six-Day War. And she called one time because she had to write a report or analysis, I guess a book report, about some of the texts that she had been reading regarding the Six-Day War, and she knew I had been in Israel. And she read me what she had wrote and asked me what I thought about it. And frankly, I was horrified at what she had written and the approach and the material, actually, that they had given her to review. And so I said, well, Amanda, I have a totally different take on this. My take is nowhere near as liberal and detrimental to the Israeli cause and the approach that they had done. They had been the aggressor, and they had done all the wrong things, and they shouldn't have done it, and they were a terrible nation and people. And I just know better than that because I was there.
That's great. I'd like to get back to that in a minute. But before we go there, I'm curious about a couple of things on your most recent book. In particular, you talked about why you got started writing the book. And there's been talk about, titling the book a number of different ways. You were talking about originally calling it Sparkling Cider, which relates, we'll talk about your events in Israel.
Right, that's where it started.
Where it started. But also you have, and as long as I've known you, my whole life, I think you've used the nickname TopCat. And you've got that in the title of your book, as well as the the story of an electronic engineer in the CIA, but you also really started off with a title, The Accidental Spy.
Yes.
And so if you could focus on that for a second and tell me about, how you became the accidental spy, and you then kind of ended up becoming TopCat throughout this.
Well, the TopCat comes from my initials, of course, T.C. Anderson. And so T.C. was quickly turned into TopCat when I needed a handle, something to call me. The accidental spy, well, sparkling cider was the first thing I called it, because I was really talking about Israel and the sparkling cider they made in Israel. And so that's what I called it to begin with, because I really had no intent in the beginning to write what I wound up writing. I was just really writing my memoirs for Amanda. That's why I was mentioning that first, about the Six-Day War. And I called that TopCat and wrote up some notes and sent it to her. Then you saw that, and Drew, and a few other people saw that, and they said, Ted, well, you got more stories than that. Why don't you start putting some more down? And so I put some more down, and TopCat no longer, sparkling cider, rather, which is what I was calling it at the time, was no longer sufficient. The request of Drew and several other people, Amanda as well, they wanted me to put some more stories down and write some more about what I had done. And Drew in particular kept saying, Dad, you got to write that down. You got to write that down. So I began to write it down, and my first thought was I never intended to have anything to do with the CIA at all, and everything that happened was really quite by accident. That is, it wasn't planned. I can say I set out to do this, and I knew I was going to do it from childhood. No, it wasn't that at all. It's just I kept finding myself in situations that I had never really intended, and they were sort of all an accident in that sense. And so my first thought of it was The Accidental Spy. Then people thought that was really too limiting of a title, and so we tried a number of different ones, like TopCat and the CIA and so on. I prefer right now just plain TopCat, because the book I've written is not a spy novel. It was never intended to be a spy novel. It's my personal remembrances, and it doesn't use a lot of foul language. It's not full of sex and violence. It doesn't have a lot of twists and turns and unexpected cliffhanging escape and chase scenes. It's a rather, to me, interesting story of what happened to a guy who got caught up in the conflicts of the Cold War and what was going on in a turbulent time in our history, and basically is my life. So I personally now like just the simple title TopCat.
Okay, so that's a good start. I was curious if we could go back to the early days of your career then, and kind of what happened. You talk about in the first chapters of your book, the early days and your experiences up in Canada and Quebec, and I certainly remember those days. And then you were kind of, based on your trips, you were accidentally recruited into the CIA. Maybe you could talk about how that came about. Well,
it was certainly a surprise to me. It wasn't a surprise to the CIA, because they were laying for me. I happened to be in Stockholm. It was after the Canadian trips, which were really the first long-distance foreign trips I began to take. Then I went to Europe, and I happened to be in Stockholm because there was, even though they are a neutral nation, and the CIA doesn't have an office or any real activities there. Well, of course they're there, but they don't have areas in the sense that they did in places like Israel and so on. But there's still a lot going on, at least in those days, of interest to the CIA, and I just happened to be in a type of position that allowed me to visit the major Swedish arms manufacturers and the Swedish military. And so I happened to be there, and I was in a bar one night and was met by two people who were recruits for the CIA, and they basically...
Did you know that right away by looking at them?
Of course not. No, I didn't know at all. It took me... I was pretty naive in those days. It took me a good half hour before I even realized that these guys knew an awful lot about me.
And they were wearing the proverbial, as you describe in your book, the gray suit, right?
Oh, the gray suits. Yeah, except in Sweden you tend to blend in, and I don't remember what they were wearing, but it wasn't gray suits.
Oh, okay.
They were dressed appropriately for the nightclub that we were in, and it's a casual dress. But basically they hit me up and said, "Look, you travel around, you see these things, you get into these places. Would you mind telling us what you see and what you do?" And I said, "No, I guess not." And they said, "Great, we have other people doing things like this. They're called independent contractors, and you're not really a member of the CIA. We're not going to pay you anything, but you will be doing a benefit to service, benefit to your country and health service if you do that." And I didn't see anything wrong with that. I was there anyway. Patriotic guy. I hadn't served in the military. This was, as I looked at it, an opportunity to give something back. So I said, sure. And I went back to the States, and a little while later, I got... this was the first time I really got instructions to come to Washington. And they had worked it out in such a way that they had asked my boss to send me to Washington because they wished to talk to me as part of my security clearance. And so, what could he say? He said, sure. And so off I went to Washington and wound up in Langley. And that was really the first time that I began to get an idea of really what I was going to be doing, and that was part of the surprise. And I think I wrote at the end of that chapter, "Oh shit, what have I gotten myself into?"
You use the term goofed up.
Yeah, well, no, all of this came there at Langley. That they said we got to refer to you somehow. We're not going to call you Ted Anderson, for heaven's sake. So, how about TopCat? He said, your initials are TC. So how about TopCat? And I said, sure. TopCat sounds fine. And they said, no, you need a recognition word that only you and whoever else uses it. What word do you want? And I chose "gufta," which generally means broadly in Norwegian, "ah, shit."
Right. So, and you use that throughout the book.
And I use it throughout the book. And, every time you see an ufta, it's an unexpected happening that is a surprise. That's an ufta.
Yeah.
When something happens to you that you really didn't expect, and you say, how did I get myself into this one again?
Well, I think it's a good point to maybe talk about your technical background a little bit, because that is the precursor to everything.
Sure.
And you spent a lot of time in technology used for defense, radar systems,
yes.
over the horizon systems.
Electronic warfare.
Electronic warfare.
Basically. And countermeasures. That was where I wound up spending a lot of my expertise was in communications, electronic warfare, countermeasures.
Going back to your time at Stanford, to prepare you for this, you mentioned that your professors that were there. I mean, were there influential professors that led you into this area?
No. Pretty much when you get into electronics, see, remember this is back in the 50s, early 50s. The transistor hadn't even been, it had been invented, but it was still a toy and a plaything. Nobody knew what to do with it yet. So it was the very, very early thing. The computer had really come about during the war, but it took a room, a gigantic room to hold a computer those days. So it was very early on, and we were. I think it may even say it. We were bearskin in stone knife age. The electronic technology was exploding so fast as it built upon itself, and new things were coming about that you pretty much couldn't really say, oh, I'm going to go into electronic warfare, because we hadn't invented that name yet. What I did is I studied. I was a heavy math major at Stanford. I could have gotten a degree in it, but I couldn't get. Stanford wouldn't issue 2 degrees, one Bachelor of Science and the other Bachelor of Arts, which is a math degree. So I took the science degree instead, but I had enough math to get a degree in it. And this led me into basically active network stabilization and synthesization. And so I was really a circuit designer, mathematical circuit designer. That's really what I did, what I was trained to do. And when I went on to the grad school, and I was 2 years at Stanford in grad school, I studied more active network stabilization, which is heavy-duty math, and basically prepared myself to be a circuit designer, an electronic circuit designer, and was hired into HP.
Let's talk about HP and what happened when you were hired at HP. Kind of the transition from graduate school and your first, I think you were working at HP while you were in grad school?
I was working at HP while I was in grad school. Hewlett-Packard, and Hewlett-Packard is really the base of the fictitiously named company that I use in there. And when you read the book, you'll see that HP's philosophy, the philosophy really of Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard, has been the one guiding thing that I have used throughout my entire life. Those men were just absolute geniuses. But at any rate, I was hired upon graduation into HP, and as a circuit designer using my math. And they had what they call an honors co-op program, where I was paid as if I were working full-time as an engineer at HP, but allowed to take classes at Stanford as they were scheduled. HP paid for my tuition, paid me full-time. Hewlett-Packard was, of course, right on the Stanford campus, and so I could, it was a little far to walk, but I could ride a bike, drive my car to class. So, take 5 minutes to get to class. Took my class and went back to work at HP. It turns out that the first jobs that I did at HP were directly related to my active network synthesis mathematical background, and the first product that came out of it was based upon what I had been studying, and I got a patent on that.
That was the multimeter, right?
The multimeter, yeah.
So you had the original multimeter patent.
The first one was the digital micrometer, and I don't need to get into the technology of it. That was a tough thing to do mathematically, and it involved very, very, very difficult to solve Bessel functions and other kinds of things that are rather esoteric math. That is the only way we could do it in those days. Still, the only way that they could be done. But no, I started out basically as a circuit designer, and then I got into microwave because Dave and Bill bought a bunch of microwave components from Zig and Russell Varian, who was also nearby, right next door, actually. And Zig and Russell, of course, developed the TWT and the Klystron during the war, and HP bought all these assortment of microwave components that Varian had. They bought all the designs for them and asked me to turn them into a more complete product line. So I got involved in taking an existing design and scaling it up and down in frequencies so that I could cover the entire microwave range in use at that time, which were G, J, H, X, PK, and R bands. It's in the back of the book in my appendix as to what those things are, but basically it's covering the frequency ranges from 2 gigahertz to 22 gigahertz.
And this later became an important part of your career as you were interfacing.
Well, this kind of got me more away from the mathematics. There's a lot of mathematics involved in microwave circuitry. It is a microwave circuit, although it's solid state and made out of metal. but it's still a circuit. It's still got components in it, and they all have mathematical equations that describe what a post does and what a bar does, and what a short circuit does. So, it even though it doesn't look like it, it is a circuit. And so I did a lot of those, about a year. And by the time I was through with that, I was jokingly referred to as having designed more products for Hewlett-Packard than all the other engineers put together. And the only reason was that I would have 7 or 8 waveguide bands of a half a dozen different products, and it multiplied really fast.
Right.
A thermistor mount, you get 7 of them, you got 7 different products. That's how it was just really a joke.
Now, there were a couple of stories that you relayed to me that I know didn't actually make it into the book in the early days, in particular with some of this HP equipment. Does any anecdote that you can recall with either Dave or Bill or the Varian brothers or anything at all that happened in this time that you just maybe put into a future version of the book?
Oh gosh, there were lots of fun things. One of the fun. There are things I didn't put in the book because I didn't know how to make a real story out of it. One little anecdote was we were blowing up a lot of the Redstone missiles in Redstone, Alabama. And of course, at the end of the war, the Russians got their German rocket scientists, and we got our German rocket scientists, and we put our Germans in Huntsville, and our Germans took the V2 and basically turned it into the Redstone. And they were blowing up on launch, and that's not good. So they began to trace it down, and they traced it down that the problem was one of the components, the microwave components that I had designed, which was an X-band thermistor mount. And a thermistor mount is a way of measuring our microwave power in a waveguide, and the thermistors were becoming unsoldered at one end, and therefore the heat sensing, a thermistor is a heat sensing device that senses the amount of RF power in the waveguide by the heat produced in the thermistor mount. And if one end of the thermistor becomes disconnected, it doesn't know how much power is in there, and so it was registering no power, and they kept pouring more power in, which was the wrong thing to do, and they would overload and blow up the missile. So I, being the responsible and sustaining engineer for that product, was rapidly summoned into service to take a look at it, and we determined that it was a problem with the way the procedure that was being used by the NASA certified. Well, NASA didn't exist then. It was the Army certified solderers that were soldering in the thermistors themselves, which are tiny little things that you use a microscope to solder in. And we found out that the fluxes that they were using was incorrect and was not resulting in the proper, they call a rosin joint than a silver solder, the silver solder. It was a rosin joint made of flux rather than silver, as it should be. So we were able to identify relatively what the problem was, fix it, and that problem went away. So I wound up, during that I went to Redstone several times, and Alabama. Another interesting one had to do with the underground testing of the atomic bomb. I think this is the one you're thinking of.
Yeah.
That when we signed the atomic treaty and basically said there will be no more atmospheric testing, which was a good thing to do because sure destroying the atmosphere. And we went to underground testing, and we had to dig deep tunnels underground and put the warhead to be tested at the end of the tunnel.
And this was in Arizona?
No, it was in Nevada.
Nevada.
Near Kirkland Air Force Base.
Okay.
And they would dig a vertical shaft down maybe 2,000 feet, a horizontal shaft, put the device at the end of the horizontal shaft, fill the whole thing up with dirt. After they'd run all the cables from the device itself up to the ground, and then they would have instrumentation vans surrounding the shaft in a large circle and set off the device. And when you set one of these things off, the ground actually rises up like a balloon and then collapses back down. It's like when you drop a pebble in a glass of milk or bottled water or something on. You see this big mound of material build up, and then it subsides back down into the hole. Well, this particular test, they got more yield out of the device under test than they thought they were going to get, and the net result was that the blast radius was bigger than they had anticipated and exceeded the radius at which they parked all the vans, and the vans all rolled into the hole. And so all of the instrumentation of almost, well, I can't say all of which, but a great deal of which was made by Hewlett-Packard, rolled over with the vans all into the hole, and that was another oofda. Actually, that jumped me ahead a little bit, because after I finished doing all of the individual components, I got further and further away from the individual circuit design and started taking all of these things and putting them together into systems. And this has been the trend of my career more than anything else, was that I started out as a circuit designer, designing little bitsy parts of a device to do a specific job. Then I began taking bigger and bigger groups of devices, and then whole instruments, and then multiple instruments to do a measurement job. And so I got in from circuit design to system design, and was dealing with data acquisition systems and communication systems. So you will see and hear me use the word in the book frequently, systems instead of circuit. By that I mean a group, a collection of devices, electronic devices, to accomplish a much larger task, like a whole communication system involving receivers, detectors, transmitters, antennas, transports, all sorts of personnel on the ground are part of the system. Fueling, everything is part of the system. In Israel, that's where I got into a lot of the system business. The picture on the front of the book that I use, which may not be used later, is a Russian system. It's a Russian SAM system. And I put it on there because the Mossad of Israel swiped one from the Russians, and I was involved in getting it. Mostly, not getting it, mostly taking it apart in such a way that it could be put back together again. We would know what.
I think I'd like to talk about 1967 and what happened in the next part of our interview.
Okay.
And just to wrap up here today, was there any personal anecdote you could share about your time working the Packards and or the Varian brothers?
Well, I worked with them both. I knew the Packards much more personally than Sig and Russell Varian. I can't say that I was close to them. We had those two men are perhaps the most gifted businessmen Silicon Valley has ever. One of the personal little things that when my first two sons were born, Mrs. Packard came over to the hospital and gave baby blankets to our newborns.
These are the blue.
These are the blue babies.
Blue babies.
The HP blue blanket babies, they call them. Things like that are not in the book, but that is typical of the types of things that both Flo Hewlett and Lucille Packard did. And their closeness and concern about their employees, which is what really made Hewlett-Packard the great company that it became.
Wonderful. So next time we'll talk a little bit about 1967 and Israel and the Mossad and the Yom Kippur War.
And why I started this whole thing for Amanda.
Right. So thanks, and we'll talk to you next time.
Okay.